I never believed in monsters until something started walking outside my house at night, and it was tall enough to look through my second-floor window without climbing anything. My name does not matter, but what happened in my town does, because the people who disappeared were not taken by accidents or animals, and every one of us who survived knows we were hunted by something that was thinking. We later learned to call it a Dogman, but at the time it was just the shape that waited in the trees and moved closer every time someone tried to leave. If you are here for real stories that do not pull their punches, then subscribe right now and tell me in the comments what kind of story you want next, because the ones people send me are often worse than anything I can make up. Now listen carefully, because what I am about to tell you is the only reason some of us are still alive. The first sign that something was wrong in our town did not come from a scream or a disappearance, but from silence. Because the forest that surrounded our homes had always been loud with birds and insects and distant animal calls. And then one week in early autumn, it all stopped as if someone had turned off a switch. I remember standing on my porch one morning with a cup of coffee in my hand and realizing that I could hear my own breathing more clearly than anything else around me, which felt unnatural in a place where the woods were supposed to be alive. And that was the first moment a feeling of being watched settled into my chest, even though I could not see anything. People in our town tried to ignore it at first, because ignoring strange things is something small communities become very good at, especially when admitting something is wrong would mean admitting that the place you call home might not be safe anymore. And I was one of the people who forced myself to believe that the quiet was just another change of season. That belief did not last long, because dogs started refusing to leave their yards at night, and the few who did would freeze in place with their ears pulled back and their bodies shaking, as if they were sensing something their owners could not. And more than one person reported hearing low breathing sounds coming from the edge of the woods that did not sound like any animal we recognized. The first person to disappear was a man named Robert, who lived at the far end of the road closest to the tree line. And when his truck was found still running in his driveway with the driver door open and no sign of him anywhere, everyone assumed he had wandered into the forest for some reason and gotten lost. I was part of the group that went out to look for him, because in a town as small as ours, you did not wait for officials to show up when someone went missing. And as we walked through the trees calling his name, I kept noticing marks on the trunks that were too high to have been made by any animal that walked on four legs. Those marks looked like deep grooves cut into the bark by something with fingers instead of claws, and when I reached out to touch one of them, I could feel that the wood had been crushed inward rather than scraped, which meant whatever had done it had been incredibly strong. We did not find Robert that day, but we found something else that made it impossible to pretend he was just lost, because deeper in the forest we came across a patch of ground that looked like it had been trampled by something heavy moving in circles. And in the center of it were his boots, neatly placed side by side as if he had stepped out of them on purpose. That image stayed in my head long after we went home, because no one takes off their shoes in the middle of the woods unless they are being made to. And I remember lying awake that night, listening to the wind move through the trees, and wondering what kind of thing would take the time to do something so deliberate. When I finally fell asleep, I dreamed of something standing at the edge of my yard, watching my house the way a person watches a lighted window at night. And when I woke up the next morning, there were large, deep footprints pressed into the soft ground beneath my bedroom window that did not belong to any animal I had ever seen. Those prints looked almost like a cross between a wolf and a human, because they had the shape of a paw, but the length and spacing of a stride that suggested something that walked upright when it wanted to. And I knew in that moment that whatever had taken Robert had been close enough to my home to look inside. After Robert disappeared and the prints were found outside my window, the town entered a state of quiet panic that no one wanted to admit out loud, because people still went to work and still waved at each other in the streets, but every door was locked a little tighter and every porch light stayed on a little longer through the night. I started keeping my curtains closed, even during the day, because the feeling that something was watching never went away, and I noticed that other people were doing the same thing, which told me that whatever I was sensing was not just in my head. The second disappearance was a woman named Ellen, who lived 3 houses down from me, And the only reason anyone realized she was gone was because her car was still in the driveway in the morning and her front door was standing wide open, which was strange for someone who was always careful about her home. When we went inside, everything looked normal except for the muddy tracks leading from the living room toward the back door. And those tracks were too large and too oddly shaped to belong to a person because they had long toes and a heavy heel, as if something that was not built like us had been trying to move like us. What made it worse was the smell, because there was a strong scent of wet earth and something musky that hung in the air, and once you noticed it, you could not ignore it, and that same smell began to show up around the edges of town near the woods. A group of us started talking in private about what we were seeing, because fear spreads faster when people pretend it does not exist. And one of the older men in town finally said the word that no one else wanted to say, which was Dogman, because he claimed he had heard stories from his grandfather about something that walked like a man and hunted like a wolf. At first it sounded ridiculous, because no one wanted to believe that something out of a nightmare was responsible for what was happening. But the more evidence we found, the harder it became to explain things any other way, because no animal could leave tracks like that or take people without leaving a trail. One night I was driving home later than usual, and as I passed the edge of the forest, my headlights caught a shape standing just beyond the trees. And even though it was only there for a second, I could tell that it was far too tall to be a deer and far too broad to be a person. That shape did not run when the light hit it, which was what any normal animal would have done, and instead, it leaned forward slightly, as if it was trying to see inside my car. And that moment of stillness was more terrifying than any sudden movement could have been. After that, people started reporting that they were hearing footsteps outside their houses at night, and those footsteps sounded heavy and slow, as if whatever was making them was not afraid of being heard. And more than one person claimed they saw a large shadow move across their windows even though nothing was there when they looked. We realized then that this was not something passing through, because it was staying close to our homes, and the way it behaved made it feel like it was learning, which meant every night it was getting more comfortable being near us. By the end of that week, 3 people were gone, and every one of us who was left knew that we were no longer dealing with something we could escape by pretending it was not real. By the time the 3rd night passed without anyone sleeping, we began to understand that whatever was stalking our town was not just moving through it, but studying it, because the pattern of disappearances started to make a kind of terrible sense that none of us wanted to admit. Every person who vanished had either talked about leaving town or had been involved in the search parties that went too close to the forest, which meant that the thing out there was not acting randomly, but was choosing people who were either trying to escape or trying to understand it. I was part of a small group that began meeting in secret at Ellen's empty house because it was the closest place to the tree line, and we believed that if something was watching us, it would be watching there first, and we wanted to know how close it was willing to come. One night while we were inside whispering about what to do next, we heard something move across the roof, and the sound was not like branches or animals, because it was too heavy and too slow, as if something was placing its weight carefully with every step. The ceiling creaked under the pressure, and dust fell down onto the table in thin lines, and none of us moved because the fear was so thick in the air that it felt like it might break if anyone breathed too loudly. When the sound finally stopped, we heard scratching near the edge of the roof, and it sounded almost thoughtful, as if whatever was up there was feeling for the best place to climb down. And in that moment, I realized that the thing we were dealing with understood houses and roofs, and the way humans built places to hide. After what felt like hours, the sounds faded away, but when we went outside later, we found deep marks in the shingles that looked like something had dug into them with long fingers rather than claws. And that discovery made it impossible to pretend that we were facing a normal animal. People began leaving town after that, but not everyone made it, because one family was found abandoned on the side of the road with their car still running and the doors wide open, and there were large tracks in the dirt leading back toward the trees, as if something had walked them away from their only chance to escape. It was becoming clear that whatever was hunting us did not want the town too empty, because it was keeping us contained. And that meant we were no longer just being stalked, but managed. The night I finally saw the Dogman clearly was the night I almost died, because I had gone out to check on a neighbor who had not answered their phone all day, and I convinced myself that I would be safer walking through the street than staying alone in my house. As I moved between the darkened homes, I heard something following me, but it stayed just far enough away that I could not pinpoint where it was, which made the fear grow with every step because I knew it wanted me to keep walking. When I reached my neighbor's porch, I turned around slowly, and that was when I saw it standing at the edge of the nearest yard, and even though the streetlight barely reached it, I could see enough to know that it was not a wolf and it was not a man. Its body was covered in thick, dark fur, but its shape was wrong because its shoulders were too broad and its chest was too deep, and when it leaned forward I could see that its arms ended in hands with long fingers that curled slowly as if it was testing the air. What terrified me most was its face, because it was not twisted into a snarl or frozen in an animal expression, but instead looked strangely calm and focused, with dark eyes that were fixed directly on me in a way that felt deeply personal. It took a step toward me, and that single movement told me everything I needed to know about how it hunted, because it did not rush or lunge, but moved with the confidence of something that knew there was nowhere left for me to go. I ran after that, but even as I did, I could hear its heavy footsteps behind me, slow and steady and impossibly close, and I knew that it was letting me believe I might get away, even though it could have caught me at any time. After I ran from my neighbor's porch and made it back into my house, I locked every door and window and then stood in the hallway with my back pressed against the wall, because I could not shake the certainty that a lock was only meaningful to something that respected it, and whatever I had seen outside did not look like something that respected anything. I called the only person I trusted to pick up at that hour, which was Mara, because she had been in the search party that found Robert's boots, and she was the first one who admitted out loud that we were dealing with something that understood us, and when she answered, she did not ask what was wrong, because she already knew from the way I was breathing. I told her I had seen it clearly under the streetlight, and I told her it had hands, and I told her it looked calm, and I told her it followed me without hurrying as if it was savoring the chase, and Mara stayed silent for a moment, and then said something that made my stomach turn, because she told me that the calmness meant it was close enough to stop hiding. She came over before sunrise, and we sat at my kitchen table with the curtains closed and the lights off, because we had both started to believe that light did not protect you, and that it only made you easier to find. And Mara placed a folded map on the table and pointed to the road leading out of town. She said that 3 different people had tried to leave during the past week, and 3 different times the road had been blocked, but not by fallen trees or broken cars or accidents, because in each case the people had found the same thing, which was deep gouges across the asphalt like something heavy had dragged claws or fingers across it, and after that the engines would stall as if the air itself grew thicker the closer they got to the forest line. I wanted to dismiss it as panic and coincidence, but I could not, because I remembered the abandoned car on the road with the doors open, and I remembered the tracks leading back to the trees, and I remembered the feeling that we were being kept inside the town like animals inside a pen. Mara said we had to stop reacting and start thinking like it was thinking, because fear made us predictable, and predictability was exactly what hunters used, and she told me that the Dogman was not just watching our bodies, but watching our habits, which meant it knew who took the same route home every night, and who smoked on the porch after dinner, and who forgot to lock a back window when they were tired. That night we gathered 4 people in the only place that still felt solid, which was the small community hall, because it had thick walls and no trees close to the windows, and we made a plan that felt insane even as we spoke it out loud, because we were going to set a watch, and we were going to do it together, and we were going to force ourselves to see what it did when it realized we were no longer splitting off alone. The hours crawled by, and the building creaked like it was settling, and every sound felt like a warning. And then, sometime after midnight, the air changed, because the room took on that musky wet earth smell again, and it was so strong that my eyes watered and my throat tightened. One of the men, whose name was Daniel, moved toward the window and lifted the curtain just a fraction, and the moment he did, something outside hit the side of the building with enough force to shake dust from the ceiling, and the impact was not frantic like an animal slamming into something by mistake, because it felt deliberate, like a message. We all froze, and then we heard the footsteps, and they did not circle the building like a confused predator, because they paced slowly along the wall and then stopped right beside the door as if whatever was out there knew exactly where the entrance was. For a long time nothing happened, and the silence grew so heavy that my ears rang. And then, from the other side of the door, we heard something that sounded like breathing, slow and controlled, and in that moment I understood that it did not want to break in yet, because it wanted us to feel the difference between a barrier and safety. When the footsteps finally moved away, Mara leaned toward me and whispered that this was not a warning, because warnings were meant to stop you, and what this was meant to do was train you, because it was teaching us that it could come close whenever it wanted, and that the only reason it had not taken someone tonight was because it wanted us to stay afraid together. The next morning we found proof that the Dogman had been at the community hall, and we found it in a way that felt almost mocking, because there were marks on the outside wall where something had dragged its fingers through the paint, and the grooves were so deep that you could see bare wood beneath them. And higher up, near the roofline, there were more marks like it had reached up just to show us how tall it could stand. People gathered around those marks and stared at them without speaking, because no one could argue with them anymore. And the ones who still tried to explain everything away as a bear or a prank fell quiet when they saw that the scratches were far apart, far too wide for any animal paw, and shaped like long human fingers that ended in hard points. That afternoon the town held an emergency meeting, and it was not official and it was not organized, because it was just desperate people crowding into the hall to ask what was happening and why the police were not doing more. And the truth was that the police had no answers and no interest in staying after dark, and the few officers who came by treated it like a missing person situation that had turned into local hysteria. Mara stood up in front of everyone and told them about the road, and told them about the smell, and told them about the footsteps at the door. And while she spoke, I watched the faces in the crowd change, because you could see the exact moment people stopped hoping for a normal explanation and started realizing we were trapped with something that did not belong to the world they understood. That night, we did the thing that still makes my hands shake when I think about it, because we decided to test whether it was containing us or simply following opportunities, and we chose to do it with 2 vehicles and 4 people, because we believed that staying in a group might be the only leverage we had. We left just after dark, with Mara driving the first truck and me behind her, and we kept our headlights low and our windows closed. And as we passed the last row of houses and the trees began to close in on both sides of the road, the air grew colder in a way that did not feel like weather, because it felt like entering a different rule set. For the first few minutes nothing happened, and I could feel myself starting to believe we might actually reach the highway, and that hope was almost worse than fear, because hope makes you careless, and carelessness is exactly what predators wait for. Then Mara's brake lights flared suddenly, and I hit my brakes hard enough that my seatbelt cut into my chest. And when I looked ahead, I saw something standing in the middle of the road, perfectly still, as if it had been waiting there long before we arrived. It was taller than the hood of the truck, and it did not crouch like an animal, and it did not move out of the way like a deer blinded by headlights, because it simply stood there and faced us. And even from inside my vehicle I could see the outline of its arms hanging low at its sides, and I could see the thickness of its shoulders, and I could see the shape of its head, which was canine but wrong in its proportions, because it carried itself like it understood posture. Mara did not honk, and she did not reverse, and neither did I, because there was something about that stillness that felt like a command. And then the Dogman stepped forward, not fast, not aggressive, but with the slow certainty of something that believed it owned the road. It walked to Mara's driver's side window and leaned down slightly, and when it did I saw one of its hands lift and rest against the glass, and the fingers spread as if it was feeling the vibration of her breath through the window. And I watched Mara's shoulders lock in place, as if her body understood that any movement might be interpreted as invitation. I wanted to scream for her to drive, but my throat would not work, because the fear was not a panic fear, but a controlled fear, the kind you feel when you realize you are not dealing with an animal, but with an intelligence that is choosing its next move. The Dogman turned its head then, slowly, and looked directly at my vehicle behind her. and even through the windshield glare, I felt its eyes land on me as if it had recognized me from the streetlight. And in that moment, I understood the truth, because it was not stopping us to block the road, and it was not stopping us to attack, because it was doing something far worse. It was counting us, and it was deciding who it wanted. After the Dogman stepped away from Mara's truck and let us drive back toward town, neither of us spoke, because the silence inside the vehicles felt heavier than any words we could have said. And when we finally stopped in front of the community hall, the others could see from our faces that something had changed. We told them what happened on the road, and when I described the way it had placed its hand against the glass and leaned down to look inside, several people started to cry quietly, because the idea that something that large and inhuman could behave with such careful intention made it feel less like a wild threat and more like a thinking one. That night, Daniel insisted that we could not keep waiting to be picked off, because fear was slowly turning us into prey. And he said that if the Dogman was confident enough to stand in the road, then it meant it believed we could not hurt it, which meant we needed to find a way to prove it wrong. We did not have weapons that could really stop something like that, but we had flares, and we had tools, and we had people who were tired of being hunted. And Daniel believed that if we could corner it in the open and overwhelm it, then we might be able to force it to retreat back into the forest where it belonged. Mara argued that it was too smart for that, and she said that predators who play with their prey do not make mistakes. But Daniel was already too far gone in his anger to listen, and when someone is driven by fear long enough, it can start to look like courage. Before we could stop him, Daniel and two others took one of the trucks and headed toward the edge of town, where the trees pressed close to the road, because that was where the Dogman had been seen most often. And even though part of me wanted to follow them, another part of me knew that chasing a hunter is the fastest way to become what it wants. We waited, and the waiting was worse than anything else, because every minute that passed without hearing from them made it harder to breathe. And then, just before dawn, we heard the truck return. It rolled slowly into the street with one headlight shattered and the hood bent upward as if something had slammed into it, and when the doors opened, only one person climbed out, and it was not Daniel. The man who survived could barely speak, but when he did, he told us that they had found the Dogman standing in the road again, and that when Daniel stepped out with a flare in his hand, the thing had not backed away, because it had simply tilted its head as if curious. He said Daniel threw the flare at it, and the light washed over its fur and face, and instead of running, the Dogman had smiled in a way that was not an animal expression at all, because it was slow and controlled, and then it had moved faster than anything he had ever seen. Daniel was gone in seconds, and the truck was hit so hard it spun halfway around, and the survivor said the last thing he saw was the Dogman standing upright beside the road, holding Daniel by the shoulders as if he was inspecting him. That was when we realized we had just proven something terrible. We had proven that it was not afraid of us. After Daniel was taken, the town broke in a way that no meeting or plan could fix, because the last illusion anyone had left was that we might scare the Dogman away, and once that was gone, all that remained was the truth that we were trapped with something that did not see us as equals. People started barricading their homes, but the more they tried to fortify themselves, the more it felt like they were building cages, because you could hear the Dogman moving through the streets at night, and it did not rush and it did not sneak, because it walked with the confidence of something that knew every locked door was just a delay. I heard it outside my house again 3 nights after Daniel disappeared, and this time it did not stay in the yard, because it came right up to my front door, and I could hear its breathing through the wood, and the sound was deep and slow, like a person sleeping, which made it so much worse than growling ever could have. Mara was with me that night, and we stood in the dark hallway with our backs to the wall, and neither of us moved, because we both understood that whatever was outside could hear us, and the quiet was not hiding us, but presenting us. There was a soft scrape against the door, and then another, and I realized it was running one of its fingers down the surface, feeling the grain of the wood, as if it was taking its time with us. And when the handle turned slightly, Mara's hand closed around mine so tightly it hurt. The handle did not open, but the message was clear, because it wanted us to know that it could, and after a moment the footsteps moved away, slow and deliberate, and I knew it had left us alive on purpose. The next morning, One of the houses at the edge of town was found open and empty, and inside there were deep gouges in the walls and furniture, and the same musky smell hung in the air, and we all understood that someone had been taken quietly in the night. It was becoming obvious that the Dogman was not killing at random, because it was choosing when and how to strike, and the pattern of fear it created was spreading faster than the disappearances themselves. Mara finally said what we had all been thinking, because she told us that we were not being hunted to be wiped out, but to be controlled, and that meant the only way this would end was if we either escaped together or gave it what it wanted, and none of us wanted to imagine what that might be. By the time we reached the 9th day since Robert had vanished, there were so few of us left that the town felt hollow, because every empty house was a reminder that someone had been taken not by chance, but by design, and the pattern of fear had become as much a presence as the Dogman itself. Mara and I began to notice something that none of us wanted to say out loud, because the people who disappeared were not just random neighbors, but the ones who talked about leaving or the ones who tried to fight back, which meant the Dogman was not only watching what we did, but listening to what we said. That realization made the air feel heavier, because it meant the thing in the forest was not limited by walls or distance in the way we were, and that whatever sense it used to track us went deeper than sight or sound. We started whispering even inside locked rooms, and we avoided saying names, and we avoided saying plans, because the idea that something could know what we intended before we acted was more frightening than any physical attack. One afternoon, while Mara and I were in the community hall, we found something waiting for us that made my stomach drop, because on the table where we had once spread out maps and supplies, there was a single object that did not belong to anyone there. It was Daniel's watch. The glass was cracked and the leather strap was torn, but it had been placed carefully in the center of the table as if someone wanted us to see it, and the way it sat there felt deliberate in a way that made my skin crawl. No one had been inside the hall since the night before, and the doors had been locked, which meant that whatever had left it there had been able to come and go without breaking anything, and that told us that our barriers were meaningless. Mara stared at the watch for a long time before she spoke, and when she did, her voice was barely a whisper, because she said the Dogman was not just hunting us, but communicating with us, and that meant it wanted us to understand something. We realized then that the disappearances were not just about removing people, but about shaping behavior, because every time someone resisted or tried to flee, someone else was taken, and the message was always the same: stay, be quiet, do not challenge. The terror of that truth was that it meant survival was no longer about being strong or clever, but about being compliant, and I could feel something inside me breaking at the thought that the only way to live might be to surrender to whatever ruled the forest. That night I could not sleep, and as I lay in the dark I thought about how the Dogman had watched me from the streetlight, and how it had looked through Mara's window, and how it had chosen Daniel, and I understood that it was not driven by hunger, but by something closer to possession. We did not belong to ourselves anymore. The plan that finally formed was not a brave one, because bravery had already gotten people killed, but it was the only one that made sense, which was that if the Dogman wanted to contain us, then we had to break the pattern it was controlling. Mara believed that the only way to do that was to leave all at once, because predators that track individual behavior lose their advantage when everything changes at the same time. And that meant every remaining person in town would have to move together toward the highway. We spent the entire day preparing without saying what we were doing, because we were terrified that even the idea of escape might be sensed. And when night fell, we gathered quietly in the streets with our vehicles lined up like a small convoy. I remember the way the town looked then, because the houses were dark and empty, and the only light came from headlights reflecting off the trees, and it felt like we were standing on the edge of a world that was already gone. When the engine started, the sound was so loud that I was certain it would bring the Dogman running, and part of me almost hoped it would, because at least then the waiting would be over. We began to drive, slowly at first, and then faster, and for a moment it seemed like the plan might actually work, because the road stretched ahead of us and nothing blocked it. Then, just as we reached the place where Mara's truck had been stopped before, the air changed again, and the smell of wet earth and musk filled the vehicles, and I knew without seeing it that the Dogman was close. It did not step into the road this time, because it did something worse, which was that it began to move alongside us through the trees, keeping pace with the convoy, and even though we could not see it clearly, we could hear the branches breaking and the heavy steps matching our speed. People began to panic, and some of the vehicles sped up while others slowed down, and that was exactly what the Dogman wanted, because the unity we needed was breaking apart in real time. I saw one truck swerve as something struck it from the side, and it veered off the road and disappeared into the darkness, and the scream that came from it cut off so suddenly that it felt like the forest itself had swallowed it. The rest of us kept driving, because stopping would have meant dying, and even though every instinct told me to look back, I forced myself to stare ahead at the narrow ribbon of road that was our only chance. We did not know then who would make it and who would not, because the only thing we understood was that the Dogman was no longer pretending to let us go. It was chasing us. By the time the first lights of the highway appeared through the trees, there were only 3 vehicles left in the convoy, and even then, we could feel the Dogman moving just beyond the edge of the road, as if it was deciding whether this boundary meant anything to it. The forest began to thin, and with it the sense of being enclosed, but the smell of wet earth and musk did not fade, which told us that the thing that had claimed our town was still close enough to reach out if it chose to. Mara's truck was in front of mine, and I watched the red glow of her taillights, as if they were the only proof that I was still part of the human world, because behind us there was nothing but darkness and the memory of everything we had lost. When we finally crossed onto the highway, the air felt different, and not just because the road was wider and the lights were brighter, but because something invisible had been left behind, like stepping out of a room where someone had been holding their breath for too long. We did not stop until we reached the next town, and when we did, people came out to stare at us as if we were ghosts, because our vehicles were damaged and our faces were hollow, and our eyes looked like they had seen something that did not belong in daylight. The authorities treated it like a mass evacuation, and they asked us what had happened, and we told them everything we could. But even as we spoke, I could tell that most of what we said would never make it into any official report, because it was easier to blame wild animals and accidents than to admit something intelligent had taken control of an entire town. In the weeks that followed, the place where we used to live was slowly emptied, and eventually it was declared unsafe, and the forest was allowed to move back in. But I know that whatever lived there was not destroyed, because no one ever went back to look for it. Mara still wakes up some nights convinced she hears footsteps outside her new home, and I still avoid windows after dark, because fear like that does not fade just because you cross a line on a map. The worst part is not that we were hunted, but that we were chosen, because the Dogman did not take everyone, and it did not kill us all, because it decided who could leave and who had to stay, and that means somewhere out there, it is still making those choices. And if you ever find yourself in a place where the forest feels too quiet and the air smells like rain even when the sky is clear, then you should remember this story, because some borders are not marked by signs or fences, but by the things that stand just beyond them and wait. If you are still here, then you are one of the few who wanted to know how far this really went, because stories like this do not end when the people escape, since the thing that caused them is still out there, watching and waiting for the next place to claim. So if you want to hear more true-style horror stories like this, stories about creatures and places that do not follow the rules we think they should, then you need to subscribe, and you need to like this video, because every time you do, you help bring another story out of the dark and into the light. And tell me in the comments what you want to hear next, because whether it is another Dogman encounter, a forgotten expedition, or something even worse, the stories you ask for are often the ones that come back to find us. Stay alert, stay curious, and remember that some things do not hunt for food, but for control.